It is a brutal, gruesome murder.
She was stabbed so many times.
I've been prosecuting murderers for 15 years,
They wanted to put the blame on somebody.
and I've never lost a homicide case.
They wanted to get me to admit that I murdered her.
My job is to fight for justice.
The jury had made a horrible mistake and convicted an innocent man.
I've been defending the accused for over 20 years.
The DNA evidence makes no sense.
Ensuring the innocent don't serve time for someone else's crime.
One of the things you learn in this business is to never trust the state's results.
How do you plead?
Not guilty.
For true justice to be served,
We need to answer one single question.
On the shores of Alaska's spectacular Resurrection Bay lies Seward, a tough, tight-knit fishing community where people work hard. And that gives some enough reason to party even harder. But last night at the Flamingo Bar and Grill, Calvin Lister's evening ended when his wife told him to go.
Tony?
When I woke up the next morning, there was nobody laying next to me. She didn't come home. I got up,
Tony?
put a piece of toast in the toaster. Her belongings was on the table. I knew that wasn't right.
This isn't the first time the couple has gotten into it, though never anything like this.
Tony?
We had our little fights here and there, but you know, she always came home.
So where can Tony be? For Calvin, only one place comes to mind.
Sandy was her best friend. I mean, who would better know where a person's at than your best friend?
Tony and Sandy had a friendship that was like a sister friendship. Either they were good friends or they were hating each other that night.
Sandy answers the door. It's early in the morning. I'm surprised she's up. I asked her, where's Tony at? Well, she was last with Jimmy, and she points over at Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy.
There on the sofa is Jimmy Ecker, an old friend in town for the weekend.
Something's wrong, you know? I mean, I just felt that. I could sense that. It was really strange because he would not meet eye to eye. On top of everything else, I'm looking at him. He's got scratches across his face. I could feel the blood in my system just boiling.
Come with me.
Mad as hell and desperate for answers, Calvin grabs Jimmy by his lapels, telling him they're taking a ride.
I knew that something was fishy, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I need to find out what's going on. He was pretty surprised, and I took him into the police station.
Calvin tells the officer on duty his wife is missing, and he thinks Jimmy Ecker, the last person to see her, is hiding something.
Okay, what can you tell me?
Jimmy admits he was dancing with Tony after Calvin left, but said that later he picked up another girl.
She was American native, and he was going to take her home to Bear Creek. That's when her boyfriend confronted Jimmy, and they got into a fight, and he hit him. And that's how he got the blood on him.
Is Jimmy telling the truth? Without any proof to the contrary, there's nothing the cops will do. Tony's an adult, so finding her is not a priority.
I was a friend of Tony's, so I had come out to Seward to help out whatever I could do. I remember it was real windy drive going down into Seward. I went to Mike and Sandy's house. We sat and talked about what could have happened, what may have happened. It was quite a shocking thing, if you will.
That all changes, though, when the clock hits 9 a.m. on Monday morning, and she's officially missing for over 48 hours.
Folks, we have a missing person.
What makes a missing persons case so difficult is that without a victim, you don't have a crime, at least not at the start. And with this case in particular, if Tony's husband Calvin or her friend from the bar Jimmy are responsible for anything bad happening to her, they certainly aren't going to simply come clean.
That's what makes fact gathering the most important part of any investigation, way ahead of piecing those facts together. It takes a lot of self-discipline not to do it the wrong way around, because if you do come up with a theory first, it's human nature to subconsciously favor only those facts that back that theory up.
Back in half an hour. Good.
To get their investigation underway, a detective heads to the bar where Tony is reportedly last seen.
I understand that this lady was in here. She's familiar?
Yeah, she was here.
There he learns Calvin and Tony got into a heated argument. This was more than just a lover's tiff.
Those two had gotten into a fight. Tony had taken a glass and she busted it on Calvin. She said that she was gonna sleep around with whoever she could.
Well, I'd just go someone else tonight.
I was just like startled. I mean, this is in front of everybody, and everybody's looking at me, you know. I threw out $20 on the table and said, yeah, come home when you feel like it. And walked out and went and jumped in my van and drove home.
Calvin and Tony have only been married for a few months. Theirs is what you can classify as a fiery, passionate love affair.
I fell in love with her almost instantly. She was a little firecracker. She was like 5'3" and just smart as a whip.
At 28, Tony carries into the relationship quite the set of baggage, including 4 children from a previous marriage.
My memories of my mom growing up with her were good memories. She was always happy and loved to laugh and play little jokes with us. She had a wonderful smile. Her face and eyes would light up whenever she'd see someone that she knew, and always wanted to make sure everybody was happy and comfortable and having a good time. She had very poor eyesight. She hated wearing her glasses, but she was very beautiful even with her glasses on. It was a good, happy childhood to begin with, and then my parents had some issues and they ended up divorcing.
Eager to make a fresh start, Tony leaves her kids with her sister and moves 100 miles away to Seward. And it's not long before she and 22-year-old Calvin become an item.
We went to go visit my mom at Calvin's place. She was smiling a lot, always touching his arm and saying how wonderful everything was going to be when we were all together again. And that was the last time I remember seeing my mom.
She wanted to be young again, and I wanted to grow up way too fast. We both were partiers, doing cocaine, smoking pot, drinking. We just wanted to feel good.
Calvin, he was a reckless type, a little hothead, if you will. The few times that I had met him, I know that Tony had mentioned to me that Calvin beat on her. They loved like crazy, but they fought like crazy.
You know the best part of fighting? Was the making up. Oh man. She could make you feel so good. You know, I wasn't no angel, she wasn't no angel. We weren't so faithful to each other. We both had sex with other people.
When you have a domestic situation that has some sort of acrimony, victimology tells us is that there's a good chance that the husband or the boyfriend could be the person that is responsible for the disappearance.
The more police learn about Calvin, the more they feel the need to bring him in for questioning.
Come here to see bleeding. Mr. Calvin Lister.
They wanted to know what I was doing, where I was. They grilled me pretty good. They wanted to put the blame on somebody.
Good.
He admitted to the police that they had argued, but he said that he had absolutely nothing to do with her disappearance.
Calvin sure has motive. His new bride has just humiliated him. She told him to his face in public, no less, for all to hear, that she's going to have sex with another guy. You don't need a hot temper or a record of violence to be enraged by that. And Calvin's got both.
Calvin's also the guy who went straight to police in the morning to try to find her. That's got to throw a little cold water on the old jealous husband in a murderous rage routine. But I'll give you, doesn't entirely rule him out either.
Days turn to weeks, and still there's no sign of Toni. Believing she would never abandon her kids, police fear the worst. But with no leads and nothing on Jimmy or Calvin, the investigation is running out of steam. That's when Toni's best friend, Sandy, decides to do her own sleuthing, turning to the spirit world for answers.
We have good energy. I feel the spirits are here with us.
A friend of my mom's, they were into seances, things like this.
Sandy was so convinced that, this lady, she'll be able to tell you where Toni's at. She asked for a piece of clothing. I brought down one of her favorite dresses. Not believing too much of seance anyway.
I sense that we're connected to Toni. I feel that she's here with us.
I was on this side of the table. Sandy was on my left. Sandy miraculously had a vision.
You see Toni? It's her glasses.
Okay, so here I am going, holy cow, this is crazy. She actually saw where Toni's glasses were. She hounds her husband to take her to the dump. And Sandy stops them exactly where the glasses are.
We're here, stop.
Gets out, opens the door, goes, there they are.
4 weeks after Toni's disappearance, and finally, a heart-wrenching clue. But more importantly, does this discovery point the finger at her husband Calvin, friend Jimmy, or could there be yet someone else involved? It's over a month since anyone has seen mother of four Toni Lister. And for the dwindling number of folks who remained hopeful she would return alive, the discovery of her glasses at the local dump is a tragic blow. Odds are Toni, or what's left of her, is somewhere nearby. When investigators widen the search to the surrounding woods, it's not long before a shout goes out.
I found her!
They actually find Miss Lister's body half unclothed and decomposing at this point because it's been quite some time.
Her body was still intact. It hadn't been disturbed by the animals or anything. Her underwear was wrapped around her ankles, I believe. She still had her cowboy boots on, and her shirt was pulled up. They saw that she had several stab wounds to her neck area and chest area.
Miss Lister has approximately 26 stab wounds.
And by looking at the stab marks, you could tell that it was a Phillips screwdriver. You could see the hex mark in the wounds themselves.
Earlier in the day, a Phillips head screwdriver got picked up by one of the volunteers.
There was some joking about whether or not anybody needed a screwdriver that was out on the search party. Nobody wanted the screwdriver, so the individual just discarded it.
Most likely, that's the murder weapon. And it could not be found again.
This is a murder of brutal viciousness. You don't stab someone 26 times unless you're in a blind rage. And that usually means the attack is personal.
It looks personal, all right. But there are a lot of guys in town Tony Lister had personal relations with. Besides her husband Calvin and Jimmy, the guy she's seen with at the bar. Who's to say she didn't cross paths that night with somebody else whose heart she's toyed with?
4 young children have lost their mother, putting the detectives under the gun to find the culprit. Top of the suspect list has to be Jimmy Ecker, the man she was seen dancing with the night she vanished. Just how solid is his alibi?
He had actually told the same story to Sandra about giving the girl a ride home, the fight happening, the fight being the reason there was blood on him. Unfortunately, the police weren't able to find the identity of the young woman. When confronted with the information that his alibi didn't pan out, Jimmy Ecker says that I lied to you about that story, and the reason I lied is because I had been using hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Not only was he using drugs, but he reveals he woke up the next morning at the dump and couldn't remember how he got there.
First, Ecker told the police a far-fetched tale that came apart in a heartbeat. Now he says he woke up in the dump with amnesia? The facts are starting to form a picture, all right, and Jimmy Ecker is squarely in it.
Detectives tighten the screws and force another dramatic revelation out of Jimmy Ecker.
We had had sex.
Jimmy and Tony left the bar together and subsequently had sex in his pickup truck. Jimmy then dropped Tony off early in the morning on March the 6th, 1982.
Tony was fine when I dropped her off.
For a guy who claims to remember nothing of the night, he seems to have great recall when it suits him.
Sometimes odd stories are also true. There's one key thing here that we can't overlook. What Jimmy's saying is that he went out to have a good time and he got one. Where's the rage? What's the motive?
One of the things that struck me about this case is the way she was murdered. 26 stab wounds with a screwdriver. There's 2 important parts to that. 26 is a lot. That tends to show some real rage. And a screwdriver tends to suggest that it was just the first weapon that a person could find, not that it was pre-planned. Jimmy had no reason to kill Tony. Jimmy had just slept with her. What could Tony possibly say to Jimmy to make him that angry? You're a bad lover? I'm going back to my husband? No, Jimmy is not crazy. This is a crime of somebody who wanted her dead.
Despite Jimmy's barefaced lies and flip-flopping alibi, Seward PD have nothing concrete on him, and he's free to go. But his admission that he had sex with Tony the night she vanished suggests her husband Calvin might have a powerful motive for murder: jealousy.
They asked me to take a polygraph test, and I said, sure, I'll have no problem with that. They asked me what your name is and date of birth, blah, blah, mom, blah, you know, and it was all yes answers. And they asked me, did you kill your wife?
I didn't kill my wife.
And then they started telling me, well, you're the one that did it. It shows it right here on the lie detector test. They wanted to get me to admit that I murdered her.
So the machine's lying to your line.
They started making accusations towards me. How come you're spending so much time at the bars now? Don't you have any feelings of what's going on?
Failing a polygraph can't convict him, but it certainly is enough reason to turn up the heat. Add in Calvin's violent temper, plus he's got the most viable motive: jealousy, inflamed by public humiliation. Every bit of scrutiny here is well-deserved.
They can turn up the heat all they want. Right now, all they have is a seance and a polygraph. Both pseudoscience that Alaska courts know better than to consider as evidence. So what do they really have on Calvin? Nothing.
Sheltered by their aunt at her home 100 miles away, Tony's 4 children have no idea of their mother's heartbreaking fate.
I was emptying the trash can and found an article in there about how my mom was missing and how she'd been found and how she had been murdered. And I just remember picking it up out of the trash can and feeling like I was in slow motion as I was reading it and trying to understand it, because I was 12 and I really could read pretty well, but they found her in the dump, the sewer dump. The more I read, it just got worse. She was stabbed so many times.
Sandy and her siblings also have no idea that their fun-loving new stepfather, Calvin, is under a cloud of suspicion. Nor that there is another man in the frame for their mom's murder, Jimmy Ecker.
Jimmy could have easily just left. He could have disappeared and they would have never seen him again. But he didn't take that approach. He cooperated as fully as he could. Jimmy provided his clothes willingly. Jimmy provided a blood sample willingly.
Cooperation that lands him in hot water when police find traces of blood on his clothes.
The spot of blood that they found on Jimmy's pants was very, very small, which could have easily come from sexual intercourse.
However, that spot of blood is not the only evidence investigators discover linking Jimmy to the crime. Forensics go over the truck Jimmy borrowed from his pal Mike the night of Tony's murder and discover a tag from a pair of Tony's panties. Along with the blood evidence, it's sent to the FBI for analysis. The trouble is, this is 1982, and the FBI can't definitively say who the blood belongs to.
The FBI did what they could, but they ultimately packaged everything up and sent it back to Seward and gave them their results and said, we've done all that we can do at this stage. We can't help you any further.
As for the tag from Tony's underpants, Jimmy's already admitted they had sex. Maybe it got tore off in the heat of the moment.
You have 2 suspects, Calvin and Jimmy, who both have the means and opportunity to kill Tony. One admits to lying, the other failed a polygraph. But the forensics don't point to either one, so they can't make a case.
The real tragedy here is that 4 young children don't have a mom. And so far, no one's being held accountable. It doesn't get any more frustrating for police and prosecutors than this.
My youngest sister, Heather, and I would talk about it a lot. Why didn't they get the person? And, you know, he's still out there living his life. Why is he? He shouldn't be.
Homicide detectives are stumped. The months and then years pass with no new leads emerging.
When nobody would confess to the crime, the Seward police just threw up their hands and said, all right, moving on. And the evidence simply sat in the Seward police evidence locker for all those years.
It just went to the back of everyone's minds. As an adult, I was really upset knowing still that this person was still out there free and getting away with taking my mom's life. I was angry. My sisters were angry. We wanted justice.
For 24 years, the tough fishing town of Seward, Alaska, has been harboring a dark secret. Who killed mother of 4 Tony Lister, and why?
We did always question and ask my dad and you know, do you know who did it? Have they found him? And my dad had the same answer as everybody else. No, they don't know yet, and they haven't found anyone. They have a few suspects that they're still questioning.
In April 2006, the local DA reaches out to the Anchorage Cold Case Unit to breathe new life into the long-dead investigation. the file lands on seasoned detective Tim Hunyer's desk.
When I first get a cold case, I try to put myself in the investigating officer's shoes. With a new set of eyes, there's always something they may have missed. So I traveled to Seward. See if there's anything else I could do if he missed something. So I start right from the beginning. Look at the people he talked to, try to get a feel for that. My next step was to look at the evidence that we had, to see how it was preserved in that, and get that evidence to the crime lab. The evidence was still stored, it was stored properly. They did a real excellent job.
This is crucial. Cold case DNA analysis can only work if we know the evidence is uncontaminated.
That is precisely why the defense often demands their own DNA testing. You have to make sure the evidence is what the prosecution says it is.
Back in 1982, detectives had two viable suspects for Toni's murder: her husband Calvin and the man she was last seen with, Jimmy Ecker.
I looked into what Jimmy Ecker was doing the last 20 so odd years and found out that he did get in some other trouble.
Jimmy has spent a long spell behind bars for armed robbery, and Calvin has been no angel either, doing 2 years for narcotics and jumping bail. Now, DNA analysis offers the best hope of solving, once and for all, the puzzle of who killed Toni.
When I first found out that they were looking into the case again, I talked with Tim Hunyer, who said that they looked into every angle possible, and it kept leading back to the same person.
We discovered that Toni's blood was found on Jimmy's pants. Jimmy's DNA sample was found, I believe it was in a vaginal swab. That was our major DNA evidence. It puts him in contact with Toni during the murder or shortly thereafter.
On the back of the damning new forensic evidence, Jimmy Ecker is arrested and charged with Toni's rape and murder.
When Jimmy was arrested, he was very much surprised. He had no reason to believe that after 25 years, the state troopers were going to knock on his door and completely shatter his life. He had a job, he had grandchildren, he liked to go fishing, he was living life in Alaska. And for him, this was just devastating.
We wanted justice. We wanted him to pay for what he's done.
The DNA matches are attention grabbers for sure, but what do they really tell us? Jimmy had sex with Toni. He admitted to that from the get-go. A spot of Toni's blood on his clothes after wild sex in the truck is no smoking gun. DNA matches are way more scientific than seances or polygraphs, but we're no closer to the truth than we were in 1982.
Over the next 3 years, police and prosecutors build their case brick by brick, starting with what they believe happened the night of the murder. Jimmy and Toni leave the Flamingo Bar around 4:30 a.m., jump into his borrowed truck, and drive towards the dump just outside of town. Perhaps she thinks he's simply giving her a ride home.
We believe that he took Miss Lister out there. He wanted to have sex with her. There was some struggle over that. Her jaw was broken, and he had sex with her, and he stabbed her multiple times and disposed of her body very close to where the truck would have been parked.
Taking a cold case to trial can be tricky. The more time that passes, the harder it gets. Witnesses aren't always available, and when they are, their memories may have faded. So you don't do it unless you're pretty sure of what you'll have. What prosecutors now have on Jimmy Ecker, between his varying cockamamie stories and now the DNA matches, is a strong circumstantial case against him.
I'm not so sure. You're making a big fuss about proving what we've always known. What no one's come up with is a convincing motive. Don't forget, Calvin is the one who had one of those. That could be all the reasonable doubt Jimmy needs to remain free.
After a series of long delays, Jimmy Ecker's trial for murdering Toni Lister finally opens in Kenai Superior Court in early 2010. Her children pray justice will finally be served for their mom.
I followed the court case by listening in on the phone during all the testimony, but I knew I wasn't strong enough at that point to be there in court, listening and
we have the blood of the victim on Jimmy Ecker's pants. We have the sperm of Jimmy Ecker in the underwear that Miss Lister was wearing at the time. So the defense really has an uphill battle.
The prosecution doesn't waste any time to call their star witness to the stand. Sandra Rule, Tony's best friend, not only found Tony's glasses, she'd also seen blood on Jimmy when he returned to the house the morning after Tony's murder.
Sandra Rule described him actually cleaning his hands, and as she described it, there was a lot of blood that was being washed off at the time.
He literally washed the blood of Tony Lister off his hands. The evidence today will show that guilt is not so easily washed away.
It's taken almost 3 decades to put Jimmy Ecker on trial for the rape and murder of Tony Lister. Central to the prosecution case is their star witness Sandra Rule's testimony that he literally has blood on his hands, a claim defense attorney Ben Adams quickly attacks.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I agree with the prosecution that blood will prove conclusive in this case, but not in the way that he attests.
I argued in court that Sandy Rule was lying.
These are the clothes that Jimmy Ecker wore on the night of Tony Lister's murder.
If Jimmy had stabbed Tony 26 times, including 19 times in the chest and 7 times in the neck, wearing a light blue dress shirt, and was drenched in blood, according to Sandy, how did he avoid getting any blood at all on his clothes? It makes no sense.
So Tony's BFF, Sandra Rule, says 26 years later that Jimmy was covered in blood the morning Tony went missing? Is this the same Seance Sandra that was so desperate to find her pal? I'm sorry, but memory never gets better with time. That's fact.
Objection.
Sustained.
during the trial, there were some exchanges between the two attorneys that were pretty excited and heated sometimes.
It isn't just the baffling discrepancy between Ecker's supposedly blood-soaked hands and the tiny spot found on his pants that the defense exploits. Attorney Ben Adams suggests the jury also takes a long, hard look at Tony's husband, Calvin. Maybe he's the real perp.
On March 5th, 1982, there was a band playing in the bar. Tony was there with Calvin. There had already been domestic violence in the relationship. My understanding is it was very rocky. There was some discussion between Tony and Calvin apparently over cheating. After 30 years, people recalled that fight with perfect clarity. Tony threw a glass at Calvin and cut her finger. And one of the photographs that they specifically took as part of her autopsy was a cut. Jimmy and Tony left in the pickup truck and subsequently had sex in it.
The defense argues the blood on Ecker's pants is easily explained. It comes from that cut on her finger.
Jimmy then dropped Tony off early in the morning. I learned during my investigation that Tony was then subsequently seen in Seward. She was accurately described as missing her glasses, and her hair was mussed up.
Now, it's Ben Adams' opportunity to cross-examine Calvin Lister.
I didn't expect him to fall apart after 30 years, but I expected him to show some emotion, show something about the brutal slaying of your wife at the time.
I'm not on trial here.
They wanted to get me to lie. At that point, I didn't know what to really feel.
I argued in court that Calvin Lister had killed his wife in a fit of rage and had subsequently framed Jimmy by dumping her body at the dump.
He was trying to prove everything he could to get me.
He's the guy that was guilty. It has nothing to do with me.
If I was half a man, I'd take a leg off the table and beat the yeah. But no, you know what? I got a kid now. I can't do that. But then again, and I felt like everybody was against me at that point.
It was always my position during the trial that Calvin is the likely killer. Here comes a woman after a night of drinking. You're married to her. She smells like another man. Calvin simply snapped and brutally murdered her with a screwdriver.
And that's not all. In a dramatic turn, the defense argues that Calvin wasn't acting alone. Tony's best friend, Sandra Rule, was his accomplice. The seance was simply a smokescreen.
Her testimony at trial was that she went out to an area near the dump and just happened to stumble across Tony's glasses. What a bunch of There's no such thing as a seance. That is simply not true.
They're on the side of the road. On the way to the dump.
I argued in court that Sandy and Calvin had their own thing going on and that Sandy was helping to cover for Calvin. I always took the position in this case that Calvin knew that Jimmy had mentioned the dump, and he used that opportunity to dump Tony's body there later and to help make sure that Jimmy took the rap for a murder that he committed. Tony's body was completely unmarked. Now look, Alaska is as wild as you hear that it is, and to suggest that Tony's body could remain at a garbage dump in Alaska for 6 weeks and not be touched by any animals, there are hundreds of bald eagles, which are meat eaters, to me is completely implausible. It doesn't make sense.
Adams also argues that the seance is part of their deception.
I see Tony.
Either you believe in that sort of nonsense or you don't. And if you don't, that means that Sandy Rule knows a lot more about Tony's death than she's letting on.
This seance story is ridiculous, but it sure is a convenient way to explain how it was Sandra who led investigators to the murder scene. Looks to me like Jimmy's defense is onto something.
I don't buy the seance story either, but the evidence at the scene points to Jimmy Ecker, not Calvin Lister. Ecker's the one who had Tony's blood on his clothes. Ecker's the one who had sex with her just before she dies. DNA proves it. And he's the one who made up different stories about what happened that night. And don't forget, he put himself at the scene where her body was found.
The jury retires to consider its verdict. Has the defense sown enough doubt in the minds of the jurors? Or will DNA evidence condemn Jimmy Ecker? The jury is out in the trial of Jimmy Ecker for the murder of Tony Lister. Both sides are waiting anxiously for the verdict.
The prosecution has done a great job here. Even though almost 30 years have passed since the murder, they've built a compelling case. A case strong enough for a jury to agree and convict him.
The phrase that keeps coming to mind is beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence, including the DNA, is inconclusive. The star witness, unreliable to the point of suspiciously bizarre. Calvin is the one who should be on trial. If they believe that too, they have to acquit Jimmy.
I had already set out the bottle of whiskey in the celebratory glasses. I fully expected to win it. Everybody expected Jimmy to be found not guilty. Everybody.
28 years after 4 children lost their mom, the 12 jurors have reached their decision.
Guilty, Your Honor.
Guilty as charged.
Never in my mind was I in doubt about his guilt, but waiting to hear what Judge Anna Moran was going to say was really nerve-wracking. She started hitting the gavel every single time for every stab wound that he gave my mom. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 26. It was to show how much anger and violence a person has to have to do that so many times repeatedly. And I had tears just running down my face. He took a mother, a grandmother, a sister, a daughter, and she meant the world to all of us. What a coward he was to not come forward in the beginning knowing he did this.
The judge sends Ecker to prison for 99 years. For one man, it marks the end of a nightmare.
Basically, it was a cut and dry case. I mean, DNA had his ass nailed to the ground.
For another man, it's a massive setback.
When Jimmy was convicted, I was devastated, and I promised myself I would not even practice criminal defense law anymore. I was heartbroken. I don't ever want to feel something like that again. I believed in Jimmy, and I believed that I had put on the best defense that I could for him, and to hear the words guilty in this case was, it was terrible. That was a very difficult sentencing for me. An interesting story, though. Right before the jury verdict came back, the judge called me up to the bench, and she told me they can't release him right away. They actually have to process him out of the jail. And what I took from that at the time was that even the judge believed that Jimmy was going to be found not guilty. I've never had a judge tell me your client won't be released right away. Everyone expected Jimmy to be found not guilty. But after about a week, I got back in the saddle, and I refused to give up. I always felt there was enough doubt in this case to clear Jimmy's name. I felt that the jury had made a horrible mistake, and quite frankly, I believed that the jury in this case convicted Jimmy just to try to give some measure of justice to Tony.
Adams and his team revisit every shred of evidence, searching for something that might help overturn the case.
I had my DNA expert call the state's DNA expert just as a friendly hello. And at that time, the state's DNA expert told my expert off the record, don't give up, there's more to this story, keep fighting.
A light goes on in Ben's mind when he hears this.
I knew in my heart that senior prosecutor, Mr. Gullifson, had cheated me and had convicted an innocent man. I was determined to find out the truth. One of the things you learn in this business is to never trust the state's results.
During the trial, Ben Adams asked for further DNA tests to verify the state's results. Prosecutor Patrick Gullifson told him the results were not ready. This wasn't true.
Gullifson had evidence that the DNA could have come from cross-contamination. They had that during trial. They had lied to us and said they didn't have it. They had withheld that evidence.
This is a game changer. The whole system rests on the prosecution's honesty. Prosecutors make their case. The defense does its best to present a different interpretation of the evidence against their client. Jimmy Ecker's conviction is no good.
The reason the defense thought this was so important is because that test proved their point, which was DNA in this situation is not a reliable source of evidence. The court ultimately, after a lot of litigation, agreed that they were entitled to a new trial and vacated the first verdict. And we're back at square one, essentially.
So much for the transforming power of DNA profiling. No amount of technology can get around good old-fashioned lies and deceit. This guy Gullifson ought to be ashamed of himself.
As prosecutors, the last thing we want are convictions obtained through dishonesty, misrepresentation, or by withholding evidence that's favorable to the accused. For the system to work, people have to trust it. The state now has a real problem. The DNA evidence is discredited, along with the prosecution's integrity. Can a case still be made against Jimmy Ecker?
Do we run the risk of going to trial and perhaps ending up in a situation where we have no conviction whatsoever?
It's not an easy decision. The prosecution team goes to Ecker's attorney with a deal.
And I'll never forget what Jimmy said to me when I took the offer to him. We were in a little room in Wildwood Jail in Kenai, and he looked at me and he said, "Ben, I just want to see my grandkids again."
Mr. Adams and I ultimately come to a decision that Mr. Ecker will plead guilty to manslaughter and face a possible maximum sentence of 20 years.
Under Alaskan law, Jimmy Ecker could be eligible for parole after 7 years, 5 of which he's already served on remand.
Jimmy Ecker, how do you plead?
Guilty.
I think that justice has been done. In some level, he took responsibility for what he did, and in the end, we can put this all behind us.
As a defense lawyer, you're aiming for the best outcome for your client. But in the end, the decision to fight a charge is theirs and theirs alone. By admitting responsibility for Tony's murder, Jimmy will get out of prison. He'll get time with his grandchildren. But he'll also have to sleep with the fact that he'll forever be known as a convicted murderer.
As part of his deal, Ecker confesses to killing Tony Lister, and finally, her family gets the closure they deserve. It's a tough reality, but plea deals like these are sometimes the only way closure can be achieved.
He's no longer out there doing whatever he wants to do, and he's behind bars where he needs to be, and he should have been all of those years.
We don't know who our demons are, our angels are. Tony wasn't no angel, but she didn't deserve this. I wish I could take back time and change things, but I can't do that.
My mom has a very beautiful gravestone in Alaska. I have not yet seen it, but that is one thing that I would love to do, is visit my mom's grave. But as far as the pain and the sorrow and the loss and that missing spot in your heart never goes away. It's always there.